police officers of Reddit. What absurd situation have you just happened upon and realized no one called the cops? Story 1. I was off duty, playing poker with some neighbors and friends. One of the guys at the table was a tough Vietnam vet. In the middle of a hand, he downed his glass of scotch, hit himself in the chest, lit a cigarette, and stood up. "Well, I am having a heart attack," he said, before walking out and driving himself to the hospital. Everyone thought he was joking. Sure enough, he really was having a heart attack, and he survived. Before we continue, do us a quick favor. Smash that like button and subscribe to support our channel. Story 2. I do mountain bike patrol in a medium-sized city. One morning, just after rush hour, I spotted a little kid, probably 3 or 4 years old, standing on the side of the road with no parents in sight. I stopped and asked him where his parents were, and he just shrugged. I called it in, and shortly after, some guy ran out of the townhomes across the street and said the kid had been standing there for a few hours. He claimed he was keeping an eye on him. There were people around the area, but strangely, no one ever called it in. Long story short, the boy had wandered out of the room he and his mom were staying in nearby. It was a women's shelter, and somehow he managed to slip past both the manager and a court police officer. His mother had died from a heroin overdose 3 days earlier. When he got hungry, he left the room and wandered into the street. No one had even checked on her, despite the smell. Edit. Since some people asked for clarification, this wasn't a homeless shelter. It was a shelter for abused women and children who had nowhere else to go. It was more like a secure hotel, meant to provide temporary housing until social workers could find better accommodations. The women were free to come and go, and it didn't have the kind of full-time staff you'd see in a homeless shelter or rehabilitation facility. Edit 2. Thanks to the kind Redditor who gave me gold, but please consider helping someone else directly. It's getting hot out. Go buy some bottled water for your local homeless folks or donate to a charity. And please, push your legislators to fix our healthcare and rehabilitation systems. Millions suffer because we lack the resources to help the mentally ill and the neglected. And we desperately need to end the war on drugs. It only keeps the cycle going. Story 3. I was on my way home at the end of my shift when I saw a low-priority call pop up on my in-car computer for a woman who had called because there was a strange car parked in front of her house. It was about 1 a.m. I decided to swing by and clear it out. When I got there, the car was actually in her yard, had crashed into a tree, and all the doors and trunk were open. Nobody was around. I ran the tag and was standing in the street when I heard a voice say, "Excuse me, sir, can you help me?" A guy walked out of the shadows from between 2 houses across the street and collapsed at my feet. I checked him and found he had been shot about an inch above the base of his penis. He was still conscious but wouldn't provide any information about who shot him or what was going on. It remained a mystery for the next 20 minutes or so until another unit in the area stopped a guy walking down the street carrying a carburetor. He claimed he was just waiting for a ride, but he had the same last name as the registered owner of the car, so he was detained. After wading through a long story full of lies and tracking down some of the other involved parties, we got a rough idea of what happened. Apparently, the crashed car was being driven by Carburetor Guy, who was a local gang member who had been hot-rodding through a neighborhood run by a different gang. That gang piled into a car, and a chase ensued, eventually causing Carburetor Guy to crash into the complainant's front yard. Carburetor Guy and his buddies fled on foot. However, he remembered that a particularly valuable carburetor was in the trunk, so he returned and retrieved it. But by this time, the other gang was there, and they produced several firearms and robbed him of his sunglasses. He gave them over but kept the carb when one of the other gang members started shooting. He was also armed and returned fire, managing to hit his assailant, who was by now at the hospital getting a large amount of blood drained from his punctured bladder. Story 4. About 3 weeks after I started, I was on my way to our off-site property control. I was driving through a residential area, partly to avoid traffic, partly to get a better feel for my new beat, when I passed a house with smoke pouring from the eaves. 2 guys were standing across the street, just watching. As I stopped, they pointed and said, "I think there's a fire." Think was an understatement. The house was completely filled with smoke, the windows blackened with soot, and still no one had called it in. The two guys just stood there chatting like nothing was wrong. I couldn't see any flames, but it was July 10th, a bright sunny morning. There was no mistaking a house fire. I called it in and tried to gain access, yelling for survivors. I had zero fire training, but I knew enough to realize that if anyone was inside, I wouldn't be much help. I'd just end up another body for the firefighters to drag out. Still, I had to try. I ran into the backyard, vaulting over the hood of a minivan and sliding across like a Duke brother because junk was piled everywhere. In the process, I broke part of a wooden fence, which jammed my radio's key button open. Without realizing it, I now had an open mic, broadcasting my heavy breathing and shouts for survivors to everyone on the channel. I dropped to the deck and looked through the sliding glass door. There was only about 4 inches of visibility above the floor. I kept calling out but heard nothing back. When fire arrived, they had to make a slow entry. The front door had been barricaded. That's when I knew something was off. My suspicions were confirmed when they started bringing people out. 4 children, a mother, and finally the father. He was the only survivor. Everyone else, except an infant, had been murdered with a kitchen knife. Doing CPR on a child you can already tell is gone is something that sticks with you. It haunts me to this day. I never thought I'd feel the urge to take someone's life, but in that moment, watching firefighters drag out those kids, trying to revive one who'd been murdered by his own father, I don't think I've ever wanted to choke the life out of someone more. Talking about it helps, but it never really stops hurting. Story 5. I started my 4 to midnight shift by heading straight out to grab a coffee. It was a beautiful summer day, people everywhere. As I pulled into a parking space, I noticed a man lying on the ground in front of a park bench. I jumped out of my cruiser, grabbed my first aid bag, and called it in. The guy was conscious but barely responsive. It felt like something out of a movie. We were literally doing the old blink if you can hear me routine. Rescue arrived and transported him to the hospital. Later, I found out he had suffered a severe grand mal seizure and was still postictal when I got there. The frustrating part was the dozens of people milling about that couldn't even bother themselves to call 911. Never mind, find out if the guy was okay. Story 6. I am not in law enforcement anymore, but I spent about 12 years in a large city. When I was a patrolman, I got a call about someone setting off fireworks in a strip mall at around 2 a.m. Pretty standard call. We'd usually just check the area and clear it. I rolled through the parking lot and didn't see anything, but I noticed the lights were on inside one of the businesses. I won't say what kind of business, but it was owned by a fairly prominent local businessman. The front door was unlocked, which immediately raised a red flag, since burglaries were common in that area. I called dispatch to get a business rep and then started clearing the building. That's when I found the owner and several other well-known locals gathered in a back room around a poker table. One guy was sitting down with a pile of coats in his lap. He looked like he was in pain. I noticed blood droplets under his chair and asked what was going on. He broke down, moved the coats, and revealed a gunshot wound in his thigh. Turns out they'd been running a high-stakes poker game every week. Someone tried to rob it. Things went sideways, and the guy got shot. A bystander heard the gunshot and called it in as fireworks. The players had no intention of calling the cops. They were already arranging for a doctor to patch him up off the books. Gambling is illegal in the state I worked in, but honestly, we wouldn't have cared. What mattered was the shooting. We eventually caught the suspect, but the DA wouldn't prosecute because the victim and witnesses refused to testify. The victim recovered fine. Later, one of the players I interviewed told me they'd been robbed of over $30,000 that night. Story 7. I've seen a lot. Everything from the usual drive-bys, gang violence, etc., to the infuriating child abuse and exploitation cases. But honestly, the most absurd situation where no one bothered to call 911 happened right across the street from me. My neighbors were having a BBQ when their father-in-law collapsed in the front yard from a heart attack. Instead of calling for help, his son had a complete meltdown, screaming, shoving people, rolling on the ground, tearing up grass, and even smashing a window. All the while he was shrieking at the top of his lungs, "Please God, don't take my dad." The rest of the family just stood there in a semicircle, watching both the son's spectacle and the man lying motionless on the lawn. No one lifted a finger. I finally stuck my head out the window and yelled, "Has anyone called 911?" 20 blank stares, not one person had, so I called. When the paramedics arrived, the son tried to attack them as they were loading his father into the ambulance. I ended up calling the cops too. And here's the kicker. The father didn't make it. Once the ambulance and police cleared the scene, the family just picked the party back up where they left off. Oh, and the son throwing the tantrum? Not a kid. He was in his early to mid-30s, old enough to know better. Common sense really isn't all that common. Story 8. Former Leo here. I was working a late shift and on my way home decided to stop for breakfast at Waffle House. As I pulled into the parking lot shared with an auto repair shop, I noticed a few people flagging me down. They pointed toward the back of the shop, so I drove over and lit up the area with my spotlight. Behind the shop next to a dumpster, I could see a man lying on the ground, just his feet visible from where I was. At that exact moment, another homeless man walked past my car, holding a bowl completely soaked and heading straight for Waffle House. I went to check the man on the ground. He was unresponsive. I called it in, EMTs arrived, and they confirmed he was dead. No obvious trauma. He hadn't been shot or anything. Heart attack? Stroke? Who knows? Meanwhile, I had the soaked homeless guy waiting near Waffle House, so I asked him what happened. He told me, completely serious, he was out cold, so I was pouring water on him to keep him warm. The auto shop's security video cleared things up a bit. It showed the man walking, collapsing next to the dumpster, and lying there. For the next 45 minutes, the other man repeatedly went over to a hose beside Waffle House, filled up a bowl, and poured cold faucet water on him, thinking it would keep him from getting too cold. In my entire career, nothing ever came close to the weirdness of that night. Story 9. I was responding to a disturbance call in a trailer park that turned out to be nothing. As I was leaving, I noticed a giant puddle of blood near a different trailer. On closer inspection, there was blood smeared all over the door, handprints everywhere, and even blood dripping from the doorknob. It looked like something really awful happened. I started pounding on the door, and a junkie comes out yelling at me for waking her up. I asked if she was hurt. She wasn't, but then she went completely ballistic about all the blood. She had no idea where it came from. I followed the trail of blood about a block down the road and came across a giant party. I asked a group of guys standing outside where the injured person was. They all gave me the classic G-code response, insisting they had no idea what I was talking about while standing in the middle of the blood trail. I pushed past them and kept following the trail. At the end of the road, I found a guy in what used to be an all-white outfit, now dark red, desperately trying to control a massive head wound on his own. Later, I discovered he had been trying to break into that other trailer and drunkenly cut his head on the window he broke out. Story 10. I am not a cop. I am a paramedic. But this story fits. My partner and I were posted in the parking lot of a strip mall that had several stores and one bar known to be pretty sketchy. It was around 1 a.m. My partner was taking a nap and I was watching a movie on my phone, waiting for a call. Eventually, I noticed a few people coming out of the bar and lingering in the parking lot. A few more joined them. One lit a cigarette and they just stood there. I went back to my movie, but 20 minutes later, the group had grown considerably. Nothing seemed overtly wrong, but I thought it was strange that so many people had been hanging around for so long. I woke my partner, a little pissed, and had him pull our rig closer to the group. As we approached with our lights on, people started scattering. In the middle of the group, I noticed a person lying motionless on the ground. My partner and I jumped out and asked what was going on. Someone muttered, "He's wasted," just stumbled out and fell asleep. I shouted to the man, but he didn't respond. No pulse. I started CPR while my partner grabbed our jump bag and notified dispatch. For a full 30 minutes, people had been standing around, some smoking, just staring at this man doing absolutely nothing. Not one person asked if he needed help or called anyone, and probably never would have. By the time we got to him, he was cool to the touch. He'd been down for at least half an hour. We went through the motions, but he couldn't be saved. We transported him, and he was pronounced dead at the hospital within 15 minutes. How hard is it to ask someone if they are okay or to dial 911? Not one single person in that crowd was alarmed by a man sleeping on the ground in a parking lot. I've seen variations of this exact scene at least 3 times while on duty. People just don't give a quack. Story 11. I am not law enforcement, but I inspect and investigate issues at child and daycare centers. I once encountered a case where staff had duct taped a 1-year-old toddler to a chair because the child wouldn't sleep at nap time. One staff member witnessed another doing it. 3 others saw the child taped to the chair, and even the owner was aware. Yet no one said a word or reported it to the police. My office handles civil, not criminal matters. I contacted the local jurisdiction and submitted all the documentation I had collected. When the parent picked up the child, she noticed a sticky residue on the child's clothes. She was understandably horrified when she learned what had happened to her baby. Story 12. During my first year on the job, I was patrolling a frat house neighborhood near a big Midwestern college. It was a Friday night on a football weekend, so we were on high alert for any gatherings that looked like they might get out of hand. Sure enough, we pulled onto a narrow street and found no less than 5 simultaneous keg stands happening right in the middle of the road. Several neighbors were glaring from their windows, but apparently none of them cared enough to call us. Luckily, we stopped by. Several kids were passed out and needed immediate medical attention. Here's the kicker. One of the arrests I made that night was the daughter of one of my dad's best friends. They had been roommates at that very same college years before. It wasn't even her first arrest, but this one got her expelled. Somehow, word made it back to my dad that I was the officer involved. When I went to my parents' house for dinner the following week, my dad greeted me by, figuratively speaking, beating me senseless with a pair of jumper cables. Story 13. Not a cop. I was the guy they approached. I wasn't doing anything illegal or worthy of calling the cops, but I guess it was questionable enough for them to take a quick detour to investigate. I will start by saying I used to live in California, and Fresno was one of the places I lived. This had to be back in '06 or so. At the apartments where I lived, I never really had many issues, but I guess further back in the complex, in those rear buildings, some shady stuff was going down. At least once a month, the police helicopter was hovering over this place, spotlighting the area, and I never really knew why until much later. I moved to a unit in their sister complex in '08 and got to talking with the head maintenance worker who was in charge of both places. That's when he spilled the beans. There was this crazy meth head doing weird psycho stuff like selling the washer-dryer units provided in the apartments for money and straight up crashing through his sliding glass door. Weird stuff involving him and the people he had over there. The place was large enough, and I was clear on the other side of it, so I had no idea, but I guess some of the antics going on back there were SWAT team worthy. So the last of those Star Wars prequels had come out on DVD still somewhat recently, and for some reason, one of my buddies thought it would be cool and fun to choreograph lightsaber fights just because we were silly nerds in our early 20s. We figured if we got some moves down, we'd spend some cash on good prop lightsabers to spar with. But we basically used Bakken sticks he ordered online. Actually, come to think of it, our first version was a couple of dowels with a small 5-inch pipe or so at the bottom for the handle and counterweight. But those broke quickly, and he found the Bakken sticks online that were more durable and meant for sparring, designed to hit each other and hold up. So we'd usually end up doing this stuff, just messing around, hitting each other with these sticks like idiots and choreographing moves we'd follow. We happened to be doing this on police helicopter night, and they finally spotted us messing around with these sticks. The spotlight landed on us. We stopped, looked up, and gave a little wave. The spotlight didn't move. I looked at my buddy, he looked at me. I shrugged. Screw it. We're not doing anything illegal. We went back to it. A minute later, here came about 4 or 5 officers, all in tactical gear with assault rifles. They were holding them pretty casually, but I guess they got sent to see if we were just messing around or if they happened to come across a fight during their call. They asked us what we were doing, and saying we were practicing lightsaber moves sounded pretty dumb, so we told them we were practicing for a play. They pretty much dropped it at that, asked me where a certain building number was, and told us we should probably just go inside for the night. And off they went. Story 14. This was only a few years back. I was driving along a suburban road one night when a guy wearing only his underwear ran up to our police car and threw a very large sofa cushion at us. As we slowed down to find out why he had thrown the cushion, he tried to jump into the back of the car. We got out and had a chat with the poor guy, who told us he had used about an 8-ball of poor quality powder and wanted to get our attention to help him. The kicker was that he had been running around the suburban streets all drugged up for about 30 minutes, and no one thought it was odd enough to call us. To be fair, it wasn't the nicest area. Story 15. About 3 years ago, my friend and I took a road trip to visit another friend who was studying at a different university 5 hours from us. It was our first solo trip without a real adult. Part of the motorway we had to drive on to get there goes up through the mountains. It's very isolated in terms of there being no houses or anything. It's just a 3-hour stretch of road with nothing around it. It's very straight, and you can see quite far ahead of you thanks to the way the road is laid out. I don't know how to properly explain it. Anyway, despite the whole mountain location, it was a super busy road. It's the main motorway people use to get in and out of my area, which means a lot of lorries, tankers, and logging trucks on it, as well as regular travelers. So we're about half an hour onto this stretch of road in the middle of the day. It's pretty packed as usual, and on the opposite side there's a tanker on fire on the hard shoulder. The whole cab was completely engulfed in flames, really crazy big flames with huge plumes of smoke billowing off. The entire body of the tanker was plastered in hazard symbols. There was also a car flipped in front of it, also on fire, but it was over the divide and in the field. So we're like, holy shit, what do we do? Our 18-year-old brains were just like, where is the adult to tell us what to do? We slowed down a little as we passed to try and make out if the drivers were still in there, but we couldn't tell because the flames and smoke made it hard to really see. As we passed, since I was the passenger, I dialed 911 because who wouldn't dial 911 when they pass a flipped burning car and a tanker that's possibly about to explode? The conversation basically went like this. Hey, can I get police and fire services? Thank you. Well, there's this giant tanker on the road between such and such junction on the north side, and the cab is really on fire. It looks like it has been for a while, and the whole body of the tank is covered in hazard symbols. We couldn't tell if the driver is stuck in there or not, and there's a car flipped in the field that's on fire too. I am so sorry because I know you've probably received hundreds of calls about it already, but there's no one there, and we can see any blue lights on the road ahead. And you know what the lovely operator said? Well, ma'am, it looks like you're the first person to call. They ask for standard stuff like taking my contact info and asking some more follow-up questions. Thank you for letting us know. We have dispatched emergency services. They are on their way. How could all those hundreds of other travelers who use that road have driven past it and not even considered calling? It's still something that I think about here and there. What if my car flipped one day and I was potentially stuck inside it while it burned, and no one bothered calling and just casually drove past? The whole road got closed for a few days because I guess whatever was in the tank leaked out, and the road itself was pretty melted too. I never did see or hear anything about the drivers, so I hope the people involved got out and were okay. Story 16. Meal delivery service. They have access codes to get into the homes of elderly or disabled clients. A driver found an elderly woman dead, called their supervisor, instead of 911, and then continued their route. I got the 911 call from the food delivery service's dispatch, and they wouldn't give me the number for the driver because they had already left, and going back was not an option. Edit. I should clarify. She wasn't obviously dead. CPR could have helped, and not mouth-to-mouth, but just compressions. It was a food delivery service sponsored by the county for the poor, disabled, and elderly only. There wasn't a for-profit motive to continue the route. The supervisor was fired from what I heard because the deputy filed a formal complaint for an investigation. Story 17. Obligatory not a cop, but I am an EMT. We were waiting at a light just as we were headed back to the station for our end of shift. We saw a man running like Usain Bolt across the crosswalk to beat the light, and a woman chasing him. My partner and I both looked at each other, and he said, "She's gonna get hit, sure as hell." The car in the rightmost lane gunned it as the light turned green, and the next thing we saw was flip-flops flying and a pair of legs in the air. The woman was plowed over and landed on her face in the street. We immediately turned on our lights and hopped out of the ambulance. When we got to the woman, she was unconscious, had wet herself, and was bleeding from multiple lacerations on her limbs and a nasty head wound. My partner, who is a paramedic, started his assessment as I went to grab a backboard and C-collar and called it into dispatch. She woke up and immediately started screaming about her boyfriend leaving her. She stood up and tried to run after him, face-planted on the curb, and proceeded to lose a tooth. We finally calmed her down enough to get her onto the gurney. Mind you, she wouldn't listen and kept trying to walk around after suffering a couple of head injuries. Once we got her into the back of the ambulance and out of the road into a nearby parking lot, the driver who hit her rolled up. By now, firefighters were on scene, asking what the hell was going on. We gave them the lowdown, and my partner told them we could handle it, so they left, confused and somewhat apprehensive. We talked to this woman for a while, insisting that she needed to go to the hospital, but she kept saying that she couldn't go and needed to find her boyfriend. Meanwhile, the driver who hit her was apologizing to me and saying she wanted to help in any way she could. The woman kept saying she couldn't go to the hospital. After we got her cleaned up and bandaged all the wounds, she asked if we could take her to her boyfriend's house. Well, as an EMT, I can do one of two things, either take you to the hospital or leave you where you are. She refused transport vehemently, so my partner and I told her that we couldn't take her anywhere. She then proceeded to hop out of the ambulance and ask the driver who had just hit her if she would take her to her boyfriend's house if she didn't call the cops. Sure as hell, before we could even radio in that the patient was refusing transport to the hospital, she was rolling away in the car that had just hit her and tossed her 8 feet in the air. Story 18. Police officer in a very wealthy rural area. People walking at night is not typically normal. We usually just stop, say hi, and ask if they need anything, then go on our way. One rainy night, I was driving down one of our busier roads, still in the middle of nowhere, and saw a teenage male just running. He was clearly not exercising, so I stopped and asked him if he was okay. I asked if he wanted a ride somewhere so he could get out of the rain. He said he had gotten into a fight with his parents and was running to his friend's house. He was acting strange, and it seemed that he was hiding something. I decided it was best to just take him where he was going and hopefully speak with an adult who could explain further. He said that was fine and that his friend's parents could explain, so he hopped in and we went. Sure enough, I pulled into the driveway and looked up into the window. I saw a group of teenagers, one girl in a bra. They saw my police car and gave me the oh shit look, shut the blinds and started scattering everywhere. I realized this was an underage party and said to the kid, "Dude, why did you just have me drive you here?" He then realized what he had just done and turned very red. Turns out, his argument with his parents was because they didn't want him going to this party and he had just run out of his house. He could have told me to take him home, to Wendy's, anywhere but there, and I would have gladly done it. Story 19. I pulled a car over in a low-income, high-crime area after seeing a 2-year-old standing on the front seat. I noticed a sizable crowd outside near where the car stopped, but that's not uncommon for the area. I talked to the driver and the other adult passenger and realized they weren't wearing seat belts either. I politely let them know that while they're grown adults and the law says they have to wear their seat belts, I am willing to let that slide. But they will be receiving a ticket for not restraining the child. I was sitting in my patrol unit writing the ticket when I saw someone approaching me. I rolled the window down, expecting to get an earful about why we're always harassing people. Instead, this young lady screamed at me, "Are you going to do something about that?" and pointed at a large tree half a block away. I looked at her, summoned every ounce of restraint I had, and calmly asked, "The tree?" "No, behind it. 1, 2, 3. Deep breath. Ma'am, I can see through the tree. What's the problem? He's choking her." I got out of the car and started approaching the tree, telling the driver of the car I'd stop to stay there or I'd get a warrant for his arrest on the traffic charge and resisting. As I approached the tree, I swung out wide and saw, sure as hell, there was a guy choking the absolute hell out of some woman. I called for additional officers, drew my weapon, and ordered the guy to let her go. He did, and she ran off. The guy started calmly walking away. I told him to stop. He didn't, so I holstered my weapon, grabbed him, did an armbar takedown, and put him in cuffs. I radioed headquarters and told them I had one in custody. As I was walking him back to my unit, he suddenly twisted around and tried to bite me in the face. Now, I am a big guy, 6 feet 4 inches, and having someone try to jump at you and bite your face will result in an immediate reaction. Mine was twofold. I leaned back and to the side, and I also pushed his head straight down as hard and fast as I could. Because he was lunging at me through the air, this resulted in a spectacular unplanned hip toss, wherein I flipped the gentleman/possible zombie onto his back in the middle of the street in front of a large crowd in a neighborhood that isn't very friendly to police. The moment he was headed over heels in the air was also the moment my backup unit turned the corner. My backup saw what was happening and called for more backup. So Mr. Zombie started kicking at me, and I repeatedly told him to stop resisting as I grabbed his arm, got him to his feet, and put him in the back of the unit. I then approached the crowd to ask if anyone knew where the victim had run off to. I was expecting hostility because A, it's a hostile neighborhood, and B, while I was defending myself from an attack, I didn't expect them to care about me and my safety nearly as much as the fact that I had just tossed their neighbor on the ground while he was in handcuffs. I was surprised. The first person to speak up was an older woman whose house I'd been to multiple times to arrest her son. That was a good thing because it meant she knew me, and people who know me, even people who know me from an adversarial standpoint, tend to like me and trust me because I am always fair with everyone I deal with. She said loudly, "Baby, I don't know why he didn't listen to you and avoid all that foolishness." I was able to actually watch the hostility drain from the faces of many in the crowd. I commented on how unnecessary the whole thing was and asked if anyone knew where the victim went. I immediately got a volunteer to go get her. When the victim got there, I saw that in addition to bruises on her neck from the strangulation, she had a black eye and a brush burn on her forehead. I found out that her boyfriend, the biter, had been dragging her around the neighborhood and beating her like a dirty rug. I was going to say rented mule, but you really shouldn't beat mules, for a good 15 minutes before I made my traffic stop. The crowd that was there when I pulled the car over, easily 20 people, and they all watched him drag her behind the tree and strangle her as she tried to call for help. No one helped her, no one called the cops, and the one who notified me waited a good 5 minutes to do so. The driver of the car I'd pulled over got out and asked me if he could go. I said no. He said I had bigger fish to fry. I told him he could say that when he'd seen a toddler go through a windshield. Story 20. Not a cop, but my apartment got broken into a few years ago. It was one of those off-campus college apartments. We called the police, who came at about 4:30 a.m. Our neighbors were playing loud music, which was pretty typical for them. When the officers arrived, they were taking the report when the officer I was talking to asked if our neighbors were always loud. I told him it was only on Saturdays and Thursdays and that it didn't really bother us, but before they left, they knocked and pounded until the neighbors finally answered. When they opened the door, there was a horse or a donkey in the living room, several studio cameras, and 3 or 4 people who were apparently filming a donkey show. I know those cops were probably expecting some weed, maybe a few minors drinking, but not a donkey show. Story 21. Of course I am not a cop. I was driving home from work after a long day of severe thunderstorms had pounded Kansas City. I was on the highway with lots of traffic in front of me and hardly anyone behind me. Everyone was moving to the right lane, and I quickly saw 2 smashed cars on the shoulder and car parts all over the slow lane. Not a soul even slowed down. It wasn't the best part of the city, but nowhere close to the worst part. I pulled over and checked the car in front. It was empty. I checked the second, and the driver was drunk but otherwise uninjured. He said he had crashed 10 minutes prior, and I was the first to stop, but please don't call the cops. I wasn't interested in his request and called anyway. After I said the driver reported he had no injuries but appeared and smelled intoxicated, the 911 dispatcher put me on hold. She came back on and said all first responders were busy with flood rescues and they'd dispatch police and a tow when they could. Would I stay at the scene? After about 25 minutes of sitting there, the driver walked over and asked if I'd drive him home. I said he'd get a leaving the scene charge. He just said, "Man, if they arrest me for leaving the scene sometime tomorrow, they won't arrest me for DUI. They've got my car and my plate. They'll know where to find me." Screw it. Dude got a ride. I went home. Cops never called back for a follow-up. Story 22. Of course I am not a cop. I was driving home from work after a long day of severe thunderstorms had pounded Kansas City. I was on the highway with lots of traffic in front of me and hardly anyone behind me. Everyone was moving to the right lane, and I quickly saw two smashed cars on the shoulder and car parts all over the slow lane. Not a soul even slowed down. It wasn't the best part of the city, but nowhere close to the worst part. I pulled over and checked the car in front. It was empty. I checked the second, and the driver was drunk but otherwise uninjured. He said he had crashed 10 minutes prior, and I was the first to stop, but please don't call the cops. I wasn't interested in his request and called anyway. After I said the driver reported he had no injuries but appeared and smelled intoxicated, the 911 dispatcher put me on hold. She came back on and said all first responders were busy with flood rescues and they'd dispatch police and a tow when they could. Would I stay at the scene? After about 25 minutes of sitting there, the driver walked over and asked if I'd drive him home. I said he'd get a leaving the scene charge. He just said, "Man, if they arrest me for leaving the scene sometime tomorrow, they won't arrest me for DUI. They've got my car and my plate. They'll know where to find me." Screw it. Dude got a ride. I went home. Cops never called back for a follow-up. Story 23. Here's the improved version with corrected grammar and enhanced clarity. I am not a police officer, but a few years back I was out in Los Angeles with a few friends. We had just left a club on Hollywood Boulevard, I can't remember the name, and were checking out the Walk of Fame before turning in for the night. It was around 3 a.m. when we hit a corner and knew something was up after noticing a large crowd gathered around a streetlight pole. As we approached, we saw a guy sitting on the ground, leaning against the pole while holding his stomach. My buddy and I got closer and saw the guy had blood all over his shirt, and his eyes were shut. Turns out the guy had been stabbed by a group of guys in a minivan. To add insult to injury, the guys who had stabbed him were doing circles around the block and taunting him as they passed. It was painfully obvious to me that no one had called the cops because every time someone tried, he would say, "Don't snitch." My buddy and I were in the Marines at the time and were doing our best to stay out of sketchy situations, so we called 911, reported the stabbing, and got the hell out of there. Los Angeles, man. Story 24. My friends and I were driving to Dunkin' Donuts during our lunch period in the Bronx. About 2 blocks away from school, we saw a white sedan and an SUV next to each other, one of them blocking the road and facing the wrong way. I stopped and waited because I didn't have anywhere to go. The sedan in the wrong lane sped up, swerved out of the way of my car, and parked in the spot next to me on the other side of the street. The SUV started coming down the lane, and a guy got out of the sedan with a baseball bat and one-handed swung that thing right into the speeding SUV's windshield, cracking the entire passenger side. The SUV continued driving off, and the guy got back in his sedan and chased him down. My friends and I were in total shock and just went straight back to school, skipping the coffee and bagels. We went straight to our guidance counselor and told him what happened, and he just looked at us like, "Well, did you call the cops?" Not for a second did it cross our minds to even look at the license plates. Story 25. Not a cop. Back in my community college days, I went to a Taco Bell across the street in the late morning to review some assignments about an hour before class. I was the only customer there during that time, just focused on my work. About 15 minutes later, 2 huge guys with guns came in to rob the place, dressed very much like what you would consider street thugs. I honestly didn't even notice until the lookout started asking me questions about my papers and told me to stay put. The workers complied, but the safe was on a timer, so we were all stuck in that Taco Bell for about half an hour. During that time, it was getting close to noon, and several customers tried to come in. But the lookout, a large man obviously dressed like a gangster with jewelry and baggy clothes, turned away at least a dozen customers, saying that the Taco Bell was closed right before noon. A lot of them were extremely upset that they couldn't have their tacos, but they didn't think twice about the fact that there was something suspicious about a huge guy in street clothes turning them away. Some terrified random kids sitting inside, and no staff in uniform in sight, all with the doors unlocked. They ended up getting away with whatever money they took. They didn't rob me, thankfully. No one was hurt. I missed class, and I had to give a statement to some detectives. But hey, I got a free soda out of the whole thing. So, yay? Story 26. One Friday night at about 1 a.m., I was patrolling the streets when I noticed some headlights down a cross street that didn't look quite right. I continued around the block and came up behind the car. I could now see that it appeared to be parked on the wrong side of the road. Well, as I got closer, it became obvious that it had crashed into the side of a parked semi-trailer. Now, I could not see the front, so I called it out to dispatch as a property damage accident only rather than a personal injury accident, and said that I would advise further. As I was walking up to it, I rounded to the front so that I could assess the scene. When I got the full picture, I realized that the little car had slipped under the trailer and the top had been peeled back like a sardine tin all the way to the back seat. The trailer was lying on top of the passenger compartment because the car had kicked the trailer's support legs up. At this point, there was too much intrusion on the vehicle for me to see any body parts, but I was 100% certain that this was going to be a decapitation fatality. Maybe it was wishful thinking, maybe just routine, but I called out, "Police!" "Hello!" To my surprise, I heard a guy start yelling for help. Long story short, this guy was drunk and had blacked out while driving. I guess it wasn't his time to go because his seat reclined back on impact and he slid under the trailer, only catching his nose on the edge of it. 1 mile per hour faster and he would have been seriously injured. He walked away with a broken nose. After investigating the incident and checking security cameras, I found out that this guy had crashed an hour prior to me finding him on a heavily traveled section of roadway. Not one call. Story 27. I drove up to an apartment where the fire alarm was going off, and there were visible flames from what looked like the kitchen window of one unit. This was a 16-unit apartment building with approximately 40 people living in it. There were no emergency personnel on the scene. I asked who had called the fire department, and no one answered. I asked again. Someone said, "Isn't that what the alarm means?" I understand that some building fire alarms automatically alert the fire department, but this was not one of those systems, nor should anyone assume emergency vehicles are on the way just because the alarm is going off. People had been watching the fire for at least 5 minutes and complaining about the fire department not being there. The station was 1 mile away. I called the fire department and they were there in 3 minutes. Story 28. 911 dispatcher here. I got off work one day, and on my drive home, I came across an accident where one woman had been ejected from her car. There were about 10 people who had either pulled over or come out of their homes to look, but no one approached her. I got out and went up to her. She was still conscious, so I didn't do CPR. I just tried to keep her calm and not moving. I called 911 to give them an update and said something to the effect of, "Hey, I am on scene at this MVA on street name, and the lady is conscious and breathing." To which my coworker replied that they had no idea what I was talking about. None of these people had called for help after probably 5 minutes of standing around looking at the accident. You know what's worse than 911 blowing up with dozens of people calling about an accident? No one calling. Story 29. My dad was in the police force in the UK for 30 years and has told some crazy stories, some of a spooky kind, some hilarious, and some tragic. One that stuck with me was about a lady who phoned the police claiming she had offed her husband by accident. My dad and his partner showed up and the guy was in a chair in the living room with cuts to his head. She explained that she had hit him with a glass ashtray after yet another domestic dispute. My dad went over to check his vitals, noticed he was breathing, and as he declared the man was still alive, the guy sat up and said, "I am, officer, and she's a crazy woman who should be arrested." Nearly jumping out of his skin, my dad was startled, but the guy in the chair laughed it off and apologized for the inconvenience. He said he had wanted to make her feel guilty and that it was a joke that had gone too far. The man and wife made up, and Dad and his partner left. As they were going down the street, they heard screaming from the woman. My dad was not happy and turned back to find her crawling into the yard. They had a violent altercation and her husband armed with a bloody knife. Story 30. So there I was in my patrol car. I had just started my shift. This was the night after my baby boy was born, and God was I am proud father. Right as I got in my cruiser that night, I taped a picture of my wife with him in her arms right on my dashboard so I could look at them. On with the story, though, I turned down this road the local town liked to call Abandonville. It was a single strip of road that happened to have a ton of old abandoned industrial buildings. I usually tried to swing by since odd stuff was always happening in places like that. I got all the way to the end of the street where it started to reintegrate with the rest of the city. That's when I saw it, this huge man just being violent towards little woman with a baby. Across the road there was a diner, and people were staring at this happening. No one had called the police. Story 31. Obligatory, not a cop, but this happened to me. I worked a Saturday shift and a colleague offered me a ride home. I said no, that I was okay to get a bus, but she insisted. We got in her car chatting. She drove about 20 meters down the road and started making a funny noise. I asked if she was okay, but she didn't really respond. She drove through a red light and around a corner, then pulled over, still making odd noises and not verbally responding. I got my door open, and a woman came over and said, "You just pulled through a red light." "Oh my God," I said. "Yeah, sorry." And this woman just stalked off. She totally ignored the situation and the fact that I was clearly distressed and my friend was dying. I had realized something was seriously wrong and called emergency services. I thought it was my colleague's heart, but it turns out she was having a stroke in front of me. The entire time I was on the phone waiting for an ambulance, we were parked in front of a busy liquor store with people standing there watching, and not one came over, offered help, or called emergency services. It was abundantly clear that something was seriously wrong, and the only time anyone came over was when she was being loaded into the ambulance, and even then it was only to stare. I followed the ambulance in her car to the hospital and gave a giant middle finger to the watchers as I did. I spent 5 hours waiting in the hospital with her until family made it over from the other side of the country. She survived, but is never going to be the same. I now refuse to shop at that store. It gives me chills to think no one would have done anything if it had been her on her own, and she likely would have died right there. Story 32. About a year and a half ago, I had stopped a car that reeked of marijuana. I called for another unit to show up to search the car. It was a slow night, so another trooper and some of the local city officers showed up. We searched the car but didn't find anything. I cut the guy loose and we started chatting with the other officers. As we were standing there, I happened to notice a guy walking down the sidewalk coming toward us. It was late at night, so I paid close attention to him. As he got close, he didn't see us because we were in a parking lot. I noticed that he had blood on his t-shirt. I called him over to us and realized that he had several head wounds and cuts to his arms. I asked him what happened, and he said his friends had tricked him into walking into the woods and beat him up. I asked him why they would do that, and he said he didn't want to talk about it. I kept questioning him about the assault, but he didn't really come across as a victim. The guy just had a guilty vibe to him. I asked him to lift his shirt up to see if he had any other injuries, and on his back I found several welts that looked like someone had taken a broom handle to him. It dawned on me that most likely a woman had beaten him with a broom, so I figured one way or another he had done something inappropriate. I asked him again why someone would attack him, and he stated that they think I did something I didn't do. Biggest red flag in the world. I called the local county's dispatch and asked if they had any recent domestic cases reported. Sure enough, a neighboring city was taking a complaint, and the mother of the child stated she had beaten the suspect with a broom. Needless to say, this guy didn't have to worry about getting beaten by his friends anymore. I am sure the prisoners take care of that now. Story 33. I remember walking to the local shops once for some food when a highly agitated male rounded the corner and raised his hand saying, "Fine then, here I am, arrest me. I know that's what you'll do, that's what you guys always do. Quick, boss, cuff me before I do something stupid, arrest me." I was confused, looking around for any other people involved or any clue as to what I'd done, making sure my radio was up in case I'd just missed a call or one was about to come over the air. Nothing came, but I thought, screw it, why not? So I cuffed him and told him he was under arrest, then asked him what he was under arrest for. He looked puzzled and asked, "Didn't someone call you?" "No, I am here for lunch." He looked suddenly quite annoyed with himself. "Well, what are you arresting me for?" "You told me to. Do you not want to be arrested?" "Well, I don't know. Geez, Finally, someone came around the corner, and I worked out that he was in a volatile domestic relationship, which often involved him being arrested for violence. He'd had a heated argument with his partner at the shops and walked off thinking the cops would be called. He also thought he'd be arrested for breaching a restraining order against the woman, except there wasn't one. He'd just been trespassed from her house after their last domestic incident, and he didn't know the difference. I got another unit to give him a ride out of the area, and he was quite grateful. "Thanks for letting me go, boss." "Well, I had nothing to arrest you for. You arrested yourself." Story 34. Security guard. Not police, but here's one more bystander effect story. I work at a shopping mall on a decent side of town. Not exactly the rich area, but not bad either. The site where I work has an Irish pub-themed bar, and naturally they draw a huge crowd on St. Patrick's Day, despite the name being the only thing Irish about the place. Last year on St. Patrick's Day, the bar expected a big crowd, so they called in their entire security crew, which amounted to 8 beefy guys in green shirts. I don't work for the bar, I work for the property owner, so their crowd was their responsibility and everything else on the lot was mine. Despite this, I am cool with several of their bouncers, and will pass information back and forth about people to keep an eye out for. So I am on duty, part of which includes posting at the opposite end of the lot from the bar for about 20 minutes to watch the businesses there. Remember, the bar isn't my responsibility, it's the bouncers. When it's time for a patrol, I make my rounds and pass by the significant line outside the bar to hit my checkpoints, one of which is near their entrance. Their guys at the door were giving me weird looks when I passed by, but nobody said anything, and I assumed it was just because they were busy with the crowd. So I rounded the corner past the bar to another smaller section of parking where they had set up 2 porta potties for their use. One of their bouncers was posted there, and when he saw me, he headed my way and said he had a problem and didn't know what to do, so he asked for my help. I, being the kind of person who can't say no when someone asks for help, asked what was up. He then told me that they'd kicked one of their patrons out after they found him high on some kind of drug in the bar, and that he'd been running around outside by their line and the bathrooms completely naked for 15 minutes before locking himself in a porta potty. I asked if they'd called the cops, and he said yes, someone had. At that point, there were movement noises from inside the porta potty, so I went and knocked on the door and asked if the guy was okay. His speech was very slurred to the point where I could only make out a few words, but seconds later the door opened and the guy came out, fully clothed but dripping literal globs of sweat. On top of that, his pants kept falling, and from what I could see it was because the button was busted off. I asked if he was okay and who he was there with, but I couldn't understand anything else he was saying. I told him to sit down and hang tight, but he just started walking in circles around the lot, spouting nonsense. At that point, one of the other bouncers had come around, so I asked him when they'd called the cops so I could figure out when they might be getting there. He straight up said none of them had called the cops because they figured I'd find the guy soon enough. And nobody in their crowd called the cops, despite there easily being 100 or so people out there. Needless to say, I called the cops right away. It only took a few minutes to get a response, since there were already drunk driver patrols out, and they got an ambulance out too. I am not sure what happened after they got to the guy, since my boss got on me to get back on patrol once PD and the ambulance picked him up, but I was pretty pissed at the bar guys after that incident. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.